He left her alone on the beach. No explanation, just a stranger's hand on his arm. Madison walked in like she belonged, and Ethan said nothing, letting silence speak louder than loyalty. But when a life was on the line, the truth surfaced, raw, painful, and nothing like Grace imagined. And just wait until you hear how that truth shattered every assumption, and why justice, in the end, came not with revenge, but with something much stronger.
By noon, the beach had turned into a living painting of summer excess. Striped umbrellas pitched like circus tents, toddlers slathered in too much sunscreen waddling between sandcastles, Bluetooth speakers competing with gulls for dominance, and the scent of grilled corn drifting from a food cart somewhere upwind. Grace Miller normally avoided places like this. The sticky energy, the sunburnt noise, the way you could barely hear your own thoughts above the tide of strangers laughing, shouting, arguing over where to sit. But today, it wasn't her call. Ethan Hayes had picked the spot, said he wanted to be anywhere loud, somewhere messy and alive, where he could breathe other people's joy, as he'd put it with a half grin that didn't quite meet his eyes. She hadn't pushed for more. They'd arrived early, found a patch of sand between two families who already looked settled for the day. Ethan had spread their towels in a way that overlapped. Symbolism, he'd said with a wink, then anchored them with his sneakers and a battered canvas bag. He kissed the top of her head like a habit, familiar, quick. "Lemonade?" he asked, already rising before she could answer. "Extra ice," she said, still tucking the sunscreen back into her tote. And just like that, he was off, weaving through the bodies and beach chairs and coolers with that easy loping stride he had. The sun caught the edges of his profile for a second, the strong jaw, the dark curls that never lay flat. And then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd heading toward the boardwalk. Grace lay back for a moment, one arm over her eyes. She wasn't worried, not really. 10 minutes passed. She sat up. 15. She checked her phone. No texts. She told herself not to be that person, the one who needed constant reassurance, who equated silence with disaster. She adjusted the knot of her tank top, refolded the edge of her shorts, pretended to be interested in a group of college kids throwing a frisbee too close to someone's baby. At minute 17, Ethan returned, but he wasn't alone. A woman walked beside him, just a step too close, the kind of closeness that didn't say accident, it said permission. She wore a white beach cover-up, sheer enough to suggest confidence, paired with gold-rimmed sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. Her smile was already formed, not the uncertain kind you offer to strangers, but the practiced one you wear when you're sure you'll be accepted. Her hand was resting lightly on Ethan's forearm. Not clutching, just resting, casually, like it had every right to be there. Grace blinked. The moment stretched, elastic and slow. Ethan looked winded, as if he'd jogged all the way back. "Grace," he said, voice slightly too high. "This is—" But the woman stepped in, voice warm, assured. "Madison," she said, like the name alone was a full introduction. "We were just on the boardwalk." Her tone had an edge of shared experience, as if she and Ethan had already laughed over something Grace hadn't seen. That one word, just, was loaded with too much casual ease, and it landed like a stone in Grace's gut. Ethan opened his mouth again, closed it. A wave crashed nearby, the sound sharp and startling, like someone snapping a cord too tight. Children screamed in delight as the surf rolled in. Someone's Bluetooth speaker switched songs. In the silence between Grace and Ethan, something shifted. It wasn't just suspicion. It was the sense, bone deep, involuntary, that whatever she thought this day was going to be, it had already changed. Grace looked at the hand on Ethan's arm, looked at Madison's effortless posture, her slight lean into him, then looked at Ethan, at his eyes, searching hers for forgiveness, patience, a delay in judgment. She felt the twist of something familiar, not rage, not yet, just that soft internal click when a puzzle piece no longer fits, a slow unravel. Madison, still smiling, didn't seem to notice, Or maybe she did, and smiled anyway. Grace didn't speak. She didn't have to. The silence was already doing the work, stretching between them like wet fabric, revealing everything that wasn't said. She wasn't jealous, not immediately, not obviously. What she felt, first and foremost, was confusion. Because if Ethan was going to blindside her, he wasn't the kind to do it mid-lunch on a public beach with a woman who wore familiarity like perfume. If he were cheating, she thought, this would be a strange way to do it, a ridiculous way even. And yet, there he stood, not moving, not explaining, not stepping away from the woman who hadn't been part of their day 5 minutes ago, but now stood in the center of it. Grace took a breath, deep and quiet. The sun was still shining, the kids were still playing, the frisbee landed on someone's towel. But the sky felt different, off-kilter. Somewhere in her chest, the first crack opened, small but widening. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous tell he knew too well. He hadn't brought back the lemonade. Humiliation always moves faster than logic. Grace didn't plan what she did next. Her body simply acted, pulled forward by instinct and pride. Her cheeks flushed before her mind could make sense of it. Heat rose from her collarbone to the tips of her ears, not from the sun, but from something internal, something sharp and uninvited. She felt it, the moment everyone around them knew something wasn't right. The way conversation subtly dimmed. The way a man to her left stopped mid-sentence while applying sunscreen to his son's shoulders. The way two teenage girls lying on nearby towels exchanged glances over their sunglasses. They weren't staring, not directly. They were pretending not to notice, which somehow made it worse. Because when strangers feel sorry for you before you know why, it leaves a mark. Grace stood. No drama, no demands. Just the small, contained elegance of a woman gathering her things, with dignity, with muscle memory, with practiced efficiency. She lifted her tote in one swing, phone, keys, wallet, sunscreen. And with them, the only thing left that still felt solid, her self-respect. Her voice, when it came, was even, measured. "Got it," she said. She didn't. Ethan's hand moved toward her, half an inch of regret wrapped in hesitation. But before he could close the distance, Grace noticed Madison's hand, still resting on his arm, like it had a home there. She clocked that, noted it, filed it somewhere behind her ribs where hurt likes to settle. Ethan didn't say her name. Maybe he knew better. Maybe he didn't know what to say. Maybe silence was easier than the explanation that hadn't come soon enough. Grace turned, not quickly, just firmly. Her feet pressed into hot sand that stuck between her toes as she moved. Past the family grilling hot dogs. Past the volleyball net where someone shouted, "Out!" like nothing else in the world mattered. Past two toddlers dragging a plastic bucket between them, singing a wordless song. The day went on. But Grace was now moving through it like a ghost of the girl who'd sat smiling on her towel 20 minutes earlier. She didn't look back. There was no point. Behind her, the wind tugged at the fabric of her beach towel, the one Ethan had overlapped with his like it meant something. It flapped and folded like a flag halfway down a pole, confused, unfinished, undone. She could still feel his presence at her back, hovering. But he wasn't calling after her, wasn't running to explain. Maybe he thought she needed space, or maybe he just didn't know how to fix something this delicate. And then came the deeper ache, not betrayal exactly, but the recognition of a pattern she'd worked so hard to avoid. Grace had grown up not far from this very beach. Same stretch of coastline, same smell of salt, fried dough, and sunscreen. Her childhood had been full of days like this, sun-bleached and deceptively warm, waiting on promises that unraveled faster than they were made. Her father had a habit of leaving for simple things, milk, batteries, a quick walk to clear his head, and then coming back late with something new in his eyes, distraction, distance, or an apology that didn't match the delay. She'd learned, early on, to read silence like a second language. The long errands, the casual omissions, the pauses before answering, the names that appeared once, then never again. So when Ethan had first come into her life, steady, present, uncomplicated, she thought, finally, this one's different. For almost a year, he had been everything her past was not. Predictable in the best ways. The kind of man who showed up on time, remembered birthdays, and listened without looking at his phone. There were no games, no cryptic absences, no flickering signals. And now here he was, standing in the sun with a stranger who seemed too comfortable, who knew something Grace didn't, who wore confidence like it had been ironed into her. Grace's chest burned, not with anger, not yet, but with something more personal, shame maybe, the sense that she'd misread the story again, that she'd let her guard down for someone who still carried secrets. There were words for this, betrayal, dishonesty, disrespect, but they felt too large, too dramatic. They didn't match the subtle cruelty of being left to guess. Pain doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in your ear while you're walking past strangers, pretending you're not unraveling. She passed the edge of the pier, where an old couple was sharing a melting ice cream cone and pointing out sailboats. She caught the reflection of her face in a vendor's cart window, wind-blown, flushed, slightly dazed. The version of herself she saw didn't look heartbroken. She looked like someone trying very hard not to cry in public. That's when it hit her. The grief was coming not just from Ethan's absence, but from her own inability to stop hoping. She had believed this beach day would be full of salt water and laughter, maybe a shared nap under the umbrella, maybe whispered jokes over lunch. A perfect, ordinary memory. Instead, it had become the site of a small, quiet fracture. A cut made not with violence, but with carelessness. As she reached the edge of the pier, the sun shifted behind a cloud. The light changed. The sound of the water grew louder in the stillness. Her towel, that overlapping symbol of two lives merging, was still flapping somewhere behind her, unsupervised, irrelevant, undone. She kept walking. And with every step, the pain rearranged itself inside her. From confusion to humiliation to something deeper. Something she didn't have a name for yet, but knew would stay with her long after the sand was gone from her shoes.
Grace didn't hear his footsteps right away. She felt them. That soft shift in the air behind her. That weightless tension of someone chasing. Not with confidence, but guilt. He caught up just as she reached the end of the pier, where the shade from the structure above cooled the planks and the ocean opened wide on both sides, glinting like shattered glass under the sun. "Grace," Ethan called out, his voice a notch lower now, tired, strained. "Listen, I should have told you sooner." She stopped. Not for him, for herself. She turned slowly, framing him against the water, letting the sun catch every inch of his hesitation. The sea behind him sparkled too brightly, like it didn't care that the world had cracked a little. "About what?" she asked. Her voice didn't tremble. "That you don't do breakups, you do parades?" Her words sliced, calm and cold, and it wasn't the volume that made them sting. It was the precision. Ethan's mouth twitched, like he was debating which version of the truth to try first. Then came Madison, right on cue. She arrived a second later, walking lightly, perfectly composed, the kind of woman who was never caught off balance, even while following someone into the eye of a storm. No sweat on her brow, no apology on her lips, only that same practiced calm, like she'd done this before. "Your Grace," Madison said warmly. "He talks about you like you invented patience." The words were shaped like a compliment, but they landed like a weapon. Grace blinked. Once, slowly. Hatred isn't always fire. Sometimes it's clarity, an unbearable sharpness. Suddenly, everything was too visible. The dried salt on Ethan's jaw, the faint sunburn along his collarbone, the nervous way his fingers twitched near his pockets. And Madison's voice, so measured, so easy, like she belonged in this moment, like she had earned the right to step into Grace's life without knocking. Grace didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You don't get to say my name," she said. It was gentle, quiet, and final. Madison's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but it was there, the first crack in the performance. She stepped back half a pace, like instinct told her this wasn't her fight. Ethan stepped forward instead, shifting his body slightly between them. Protective? Maybe. Defensive? Definitely. "Hey," he said, softly, warningly, like Grace needed tempering. Grace tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "Oh, now you protect her." She let the question sit there, a little drop of acid in the air. Then the laugh came, dry, humorless, edged in disbelief. "Tell me, Ethan, why did you leave me alone on our towels and come back with someone else like this is some kind of beachside reveal?" He didn't answer right away. His jaw flexed. His hands clenched and unclenched once, like a reflex he didn't notice. He looked at the ocean, then at Grace, then at Madison. Words fought for space in his mouth. "Because," he started, "because I was about to make a mistake." The sentence hung in the air, like smoke, murky, ungraspable. He took a breath. "Because I should have introduced you 2 months ago." Another beat. "Because if I don't handle this right, I could—" His voice stalled. His eyes flicked sideways towards Madison, who gave him a look. Small, controlled, a single shake of the head, barely noticeable. But Grace noticed. Of course she did. She watched it all with surgical focus. How the sentence changed midstream. How Madison's presence rewrote the honesty Ethan was trying to summon. How her presence alone could limit his truth. "Of course," Grace said. Her voice was quieter now, but colder. Ethan opened his mouth again, but Grace stepped back. She was done listening to half-explanations offered under supervision. Hatred bloomed, sudden and full. Not just for the situation, but for everything it said about them, about her, about who she became around men who struggled with truth. She hated how quickly she still wanted to believe him. She hated that she noticed how tired he looked, how his voice cracked at the edges. She hated that she still remembered how his hands had always been steady, even when the rest of the world shook. And most of all, she hated the part of herself that was still standing there, still asking for a reason, as if any of this was still hers to understand. The ocean rolled behind Ethan, endless and rhythmically indifferent. Waves came and went, uncaring. That was the worst part. The world didn't pause for heartbreak. It didn't rearrange itself just because your version of the story had changed. Ethan stepped forward, but Grace stepped back. "No," she said. Just that. One syllable. That was enough. She didn't cry, she didn't yell, she didn't beg. She turned to leave without the need for a dramatic exit. No storming off, no parting words. Just the steady walk of someone who had seen enough to know silence was now the only answer that mattered. Behind her, Ethan stood frozen in the middle of a decision he'd waited too long to make. Madison adjusted her sunglasses and said nothing. And Grace, her feet steady on the wooden pier, her heart heavy but resolute, kept walking towards something that, for the first time all day, felt like freedom.
The scream didn't come from one person. It came from many. A mother's voice cut through the drone of beach chatter. Then a whistle, sharp, shrill, followed by shouts, the sound of frantic pointing, people rising from towels like startled birds. Someone yelled, "There, just past the sandbar." Grace turned, instinctively scanning the water. There, far out, a child. A small figure, barely more than a head and flailing arms, lost in the froth and shadow of the deeper tide. His motions were erratic, panicked. Every time he went under, he stayed just a second too long. And when he came back up, he wasn't moving toward shore. He was drifting sideways, fast. Before thought could fully form, Ethan was already gone. He broke into a sprint, shoes left behind, crashing into the surf with long, reckless strides. No hesitation, no coordination with lifeguards, just motion, pure and immediate. Like the fear of inaction was louder than anything else. Madison didn't follow him. She pivoted. In one motion, she kicked off her sandals, grabbed her phone, and ran, not toward the water, but toward the nearest lifeguard stand. Her hands carved the air as she shouted instructions, pointing, waving, commanding. Her voice changed, slipping into something clinical and forceful. Grace? Grace didn't move. Not at first. Her mind was still catching up, trying to reattach itself to a body frozen mid-step. She had just been drowning in her own confusion, her own heartbreak. Now a real child was drowning, and the man who had broken her heart was risking his life without thinking. That did something to her. She moved forward, then stopped again. Something inside her cracked and recoiled at the same time. Every instinct screamed at her to act. Every wound whispered, "You don't owe him this." But this wasn't about owing. This was about witnessing a truth bigger than her pain. She watched as Ethan dove into the deeper water, arms slicing, breath steady, direction locked. He reached the boy just as a large wave crested above them, threatening to pull both under. Grace's stomach knotted as the swell swallowed them whole. For one terrifying beat, nothing. Then Ethan surfaced, one arm wrapped around the boy's small torso, the other paddling hard. He angled them sideways, not fighting the wave but letting it carry them inward. It wasn't graceful, it was desperate, limbs tangled, waterlogged, but it worked. He rode the current in like a broken raft, collapsing into the shallows in a tangled spill of boy and man and breathless exhaustion. Madison was already there, kneeling, focused. "I'm a nurse," she told the lifeguard as he arrived. "Give me 30 seconds." Her tone had changed again, no longer commanding but calm and efficient. She bent over the child, checking his pulse, his pupils, tilting his head just enough. The boy choked, coughed up a stream of seawater, then sobbed, high and desperate, into the crook of Ethan's elbow. Only then did the beach exhale. The tension that had gripped the crowd slowly uncoiled. People stepped back. Some clapped. Others sat down hard on their towels, murmuring to each other. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. And Grace stood in place, watching the entire scene with a kind of strange, shaking stillness. Her anger didn't dissolve. It didn't vanish in a neat sweep of emotion. But something else, something quieter, began to take root in the space where fury had lived. She watched Ethan cradle the boy, not with heroism, but with trembling hands. Not adrenaline shakes, something deeper, something older. It was fear. Not of the ocean, not of drowning. Fear of what could have happened. Fear of how close he'd come. Madison looked up just then. Her eyes found Grace's across the chaos. And for the first time, Grace truly saw her, not as a threat, not as the other woman, but as a person. Tired, tense, protective. Madison didn't wear the look of a thief. She wore the look of someone carrying something fragile for someone else. She stepped aside and said something to the EMT as they lifted the boy onto a gurney. Then, quietly, she turned back and walked toward Grace, not directly, but with purpose. When she reached the halfway point, she spoke softly, only loud enough for Grace to hear. "Talk to him," she said. "He deserves that much now." Then she moved past, her attention already shifting back to the medical crew. Ethan was standing now, wet, barefoot. The boy was safe, the moment was over, but his hands were still shaking. His face looked cracked open. And for the first time since the boardwalk, he didn't look like a man who'd done something wrong. He looked like a man who had almost broken. Grace walked toward him, unsure what to say, unsure what tone to use. The crowd had faded, the sound of the sirens receded, the world felt paused. His voice, when it came, was different, rough, unprotected. "I left," he said, eyes locked on hers, "because I got a text from an old number." Grace waited. The ocean behind them sounded like it was holding its breath. "He has a stand on the boardwalk now, my old dealer." He swallowed. "Right next to the lemonade stand. He saw me. He waved. And I." He paused. Just long enough. Craving hits like a wave, too, he said, almost as a whisper. Grace didn't flinch, but her breath did catch. I called Madison to meet me, Ethan continued, his words slow, careful, because I didn't trust myself to be there, alone. He looked away, ashamed. I should have told you sooner. I should have told you everything from day one. There was no performance in his voice now, no defense, no denial. She's, Grace began, already knowing the answer. My sponsor, Ethan said, from the program. The word didn't feel shameful in his mouth. It felt heavy, earnest, real. I thought if I told you that word, it would change the way you looked at me, he said. I didn't want to be that guy. I didn't want you to think I was broken. Grace was silent, but her eyes softened. She put her hand on my arm to steady me, he said. That's it. That's all it was. She was trying to keep me from falling backward. Silence held them for a moment, not cold anymore, just fragile. Grace remembered things now. How Ethan never ordered drinks when they went out. How he always carried a coin in his pocket and sometimes ran his thumb over it like it was a grounding wire. How he liked to sit near exits. How he sometimes vanished into his head for long moments before blinking back. How she never asked about any of it. She had loved the version of him that seemed steady. But now she saw the truth. He was steady not because he had nothing to fight, but because he fought every single day. Steadiness wasn't a trait, it was a choice, a practice, a war. And today, when he felt himself slipping, he didn't hide it. He reached for help. Grace's chest ached. You should have told me, she said finally. Her voice was neither angry nor accusing. It was full of something new, something earned. But, she added, and her voice dropped to almost nothing. I'm glad you, she added, I'm glad you called someone before you called a ghost. Ethan blinked, surprised by the gentleness in her words. And in that moment, something subtle passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a crack of light beneath a locked door.
They didn't speak at first. Not because there was nothing to say, but because silence finally felt safe. Grace sat beside Ethan at the edge of the tide, where the ocean washed up just enough to lick their ankles and retreat. The water came and went like breath, rhythmic, forgiving. The sun had begun its slow arc toward the horizon, softening the light and stretching shadows across the sand like threads waiting to be tied. Ethan's jeans were still damp. Grace's towel clung to her legs, gritty from the walk. And yet, the discomfort of the day, the chaos, the sharp edges, the emotional bruises, had settled into something quieter. Not fixed, but known. Madison returned briefly, shoes in hand, sunglasses perched back on her nose. She didn't interrupt with apologies or explanations. She simply knelt beside Grace and gently touched her shoulder. People think sponsors are homewreckers, she said with a dry smile. We're actually homekeepers. He's a good man, Grace, a good man who's scared of the right things. There was no argument in Grace, only stillness, a silent nod. Madison didn't linger. She left them with space, with room for something fragile to begin again. Ethan shifted slightly beside her and reached into his pocket. From it, he pulled a small, dull silver coin. It was scratched around the edges, worn thin in the center, clearly touched more than it was displayed. His thumb ran over it like it had a path memorized. 9 months, he said softly, eyes on the coin. That's how long I've been showing up, one day at a time. He turned it in his palm, then extended it toward her. I was going to give it to you later, before asking you a bigger question, but I don't want to sell you the pretty part without the hard part. Grace took it gently. The coin was warm from his touch. On its surface was a triangle, circled by simple words: unity, service, recovery. No poetry, no sparkle, but somehow more intimate than any ring could have been. It wasn't a symbol of what he wanted her to see. It was a symbol of what he'd survived to be here. She held it in her open palm and looked at him. Really looked. My father, she said quietly, used to leave for milk or gas or a walk around the block,
And every time he came back with another excuse. Her voice didn't tremble. She wasn't reciting a sob story, just a memory worn smooth by time and repetition. I made a rule, she continued. I swore I'd never build a life with a man who walks away. Ethan lowered his eyes, nodding slowly, bracing. But then she added, "You didn't walk away. You ran toward help." He looked up. The emotion in his face wasn't relief, it was recognition. As if, for the first time, someone understood not just what he'd done, but why it had mattered. "I'll mess things up," he said, voice quiet but firm. "Language, timing, how I explain what's going on in my head. But I won't mess up the truth. You'll get it ugly and early." It was a strange promise, but the most honest one he could offer. Grace smiled faintly and looked down at the coin again. The triangle shimmered faintly in the light, like it had a pulse. She thought about the strange title her day had written. He left me alone on the beach, but came back with someone else. How dramatic it had sounded in her mind, how final. But now she saw the truth of it, not as a betrayal, but as a turning point. The someone else Ethan had come back with wasn't a threat. She was a boundary, a bridge, a quiet guardrail between the man he loved being and the man he was scared to become again. Grace reached out, gently pressing the coin back into his hand and folding his fingers around it. "Okay," she said. It wasn't an impulsive yes. It was a choice, measured and deliberate. "If we do this," she continued, "we do it with rules. When you're triggered, you tell me. When I'm scared, I tell you. And if either of us needs backup, we call Madison, even if she looks like every girl my mother warned me about." That made him laugh, the first real laugh of the day. Not performative, not sarcastic, just lightness pushing through the weight. "Deal," he said, voice catching on the edge of something soft and wet and real. They didn't kiss, they didn't wrap themselves in each other. They simply sat. And slowly, together, they rebuilt what had been torn. Towels were shaken. The umbrella, crooked and forgotten, was straightened and re-anchored. 2 lemonades, sweating and half warm, were pulled from the sand, still waiting where time had left them. They didn't pretend everything was fine. The silence between them wasn't smooth. It had edges, little snags of things still unspoken. But it was peaceful in the way that only honesty could be. The day hadn't turned magical, it had turned real. Grace leaned against Ethan, not like someone falling, but like someone who had decided, with eyes wide open, to stay. She felt the rhythm of his breathing slow, steady, not perfect, but honest, and enough. Around them, the beach returned to its ordinary rhythm. A child whined about sunscreen. A group of teens posed for a wind-blown photo. A seagull darted past and stole a potato chip with surgical precision. And the waves, tireless, kept rehearsing their single line. Come in, go out. Come in, go out. Grace looked down at their footprints in the sand, hers, his, tangled, imperfect, and then watched the tide smooth them away like closing a page. But moments later, new ones appeared. Side by side, chosen, earned. Not the fantasy of a love without secrets, but something stronger, a love willing to name them and grow anyway. And that, more than any ring, more than any perfect line, was her catharsis. She didn't feel like she had reclaimed something lost. She felt like she had finally arrived.